Randy and Buckley and I are starting to talk again. And we last had this conversation about boundaries. We decided 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago. So this is Randi Buckley. Her big topic that she investigates and educates us all on is boundaries. And I'm really happy to explore some boundary, I don't know, what would we say, new avenues and boundaries today with you.
Cool. Yes, thank you for having me.
So my first question is, what made you start doing the work of boundaries, and how have you evolved it from the beginning?
So I started doing the work of boundaries. It's maybe a little cheesy of an answer, but on the playground. Actually, I used to have a lot of kids asking me advice. I remember second and third grade, how do I talk to my parents about this? Oh, I don't want to do this. And then that really grew in high school, where if you loved me, you do it type of thing, and really helping people understand, well, there might be a little nuance in there. But professionally, I came to coaching and I heard a lot of what people were being taught about boundaries, the conventional wisdom, and it was very different than what I innately felt. And at the same time, I had somebody very close to me who was going through a string of incredibly abusive relationships. And had I said all the things I wanted to say to that person about boundaries, at the time, I probably would have alienated them. They just needed me to love them. So I took all of that I wish I could have said there and funneled it to my clients, and found that they were getting really good results with what I call unconventional wisdom when it comes to boundaries. So, and then it became a thing, because I noticed that the people who most identified as kind or compassionate or empathetic people, or who aspired to be kind, compassionate, empathetic people, were the ones who had the most trouble with boundaries, because boundaries didn't feel kind, compassionate, or empathetic. So then you won't do it, right? If it seems like it's not something you want to do, or the type of person you want to become, you'll sabotage it. Yeah.
Right. So you'll override that part of you, maybe that part of you that's saying, like, wait a second, this doesn't feel right. That doing this for this person, or letting this person say or act like this around me, and then, but speaking up for yourself also means a confrontation.
I found the confrontation averse, which is most of the planet, I think, by and large. The ones who love confrontation are just really loud about it, in particular. But we often want to be a good person, and the way we have thought about boundaries doesn't necessarily feel like it's being a good person. And then that's a problem.
Yeah. Right. I think that is, it's sort of like, if you have boundaries, you're viewed rigid.
Yes.
Rigid
and consequent, or people then hold those boundaries extra rigid because they think that's what boundaries are. This incredible rigidity that has no space for nuance, doesn't allow you to be different in different situations. So there's no context, and then it lacks discernment as well. So I really think those are three fundamentally important lenses to look at boundaries: or context, nuance, and discernment.
So say the lenses again.
Context, nuance, and discernment. So, I often hear, for example, and please reel me back in if I'm going the wrong direction here, but I often hear people say, well, this is my boundary. I have to have the same boundary across the line, because if I'm inconsistent, then I'm a hypocrite, or people aren't going to understand. But to me, boundaries are much more like dressing for the weather. You're not going to wear a parka when it's 100 degrees outside. At least I hope you're not wearing a parka, whereas that might be quite appropriate in a different climate, in a different situation, in a different context. So trying to apply the same boundaries across the board to different people, to different situations in your life, to different times in your life, doesn't work. It doesn't feel good. So people either are extra heavy-handed with it, wish they weren't, but they don't know another way, or they're very loose with it and just say, I can't do this.
Well, because it takes work, right? So that's the discernment part. So you almost have to have some part of yourself that can pause in a situation and respond to it. So how would you say to a client to get there, to start discerning instead of being rigid or armored in your boundary setting?
It's a really good question. There are two things that come to mind. The first is, I would ask, what value is not being honored? What is missing here? And then my real quick it doesn't always work. That's why it's context, nuance, and discernment. But my go-to then would be take what value is missing and turn it into a verb. So if you feel respect is missing from the situation, how can you be more respectful? How can you evoke or invoke more respect in the situation? How can you show respect for yourself? Let's start seeing what's missing and then find ways to insert it back into the situation. Since I'm on the values, one of my definitions for boundaries is that they are values and action, right? So really finding what's missing or what you wish there were more of. And again, the cheat sheet is just to turn that into a verb, not just to them, but to yourself and to all ways of applying the situation. The other thing,
So values and action, like give us an example, values and action, and turn it into a verb.
Right. So if you feel that compassion is missing from a situation, whether it's lack of compassion on your part, from the group or the person, whatever the situation is, if there's some compassion missing, or you feel there's some humor missing, and that's a high value for you, how can you add more into the situation? Right. So we'll just go back to compassion. How can you bring a little bit more compassion for the person, which is usually our first go-to, but how can you also see compassion for yourself? How can you maybe invite them to be a little bit more, to bring more compassion to the situation? Because it's usually what's missing that feels so gross, because we fill it with other things. But if we then can understand that, hey, my boundary is not just a hobby that's nice to do when it all works out, but rather I have a strong value of compassion. I'm going to let that become the boundary. Boundary, or the compassion might be the boundary in that situation.
It's interesting because it's very thoughtful, and I see that it's like, we talked about this a little bit earlier when we were just chatting. It's something that it's cumulative, like it's a skill that you learn, like you're really honing into yourself, and then you're honing into a situation and you're reading it, and you're trying not to come in there too early and sort of set a mark. You're trying to like, okay, what's the thing that's missing? What's the thing that's not feeling good? Let's name that first. Let's ground myself first to see, can I even not be reactive here, and really identify the in-between piece. The thing that's not being said, the thing that's being wished for. I wish you would, like, with someone, I wish you would just listen to me, or you would just hear my concern, or you would, I don't know, not mind read me, but like, maybe go beyond just yes or no.
And go beyond just preparing to answer, but actually, because we're very human, we're formulating our response before we're even usually letting whatever they said sink in.
Right. So like even before, like I do a lot of mediation work with parents who are getting divorced, or they've separated their families. So they already are coming in to my sessions kind of knowing what they want to say and knowing what they want. So they're not really listening either. Right.
So a great example, just to use that value in a verb, I might say, if you and I both had our agendas and we were coming to talk, I might say, how do you know you'll be heard? How can I identify, Susan, what will help you know that you've been heard from me? And open that up. And I may not like what you have to say, but you really want to be heard. That's almost probably just as important to you as what you want to say. So that might be a way of being more compassionate or helping you understand that you've been heard. So that could be a way, but also going back to your original question, because I think it's appropriate here too. I really want people to get uncomfortable with, take that away. I want them to get comfortable with awkward silence. And what I mean by that, I'm not talking silence that is deadly. I'm talking about not having a knee-jerk reaction response. Because so often we just say something and then regret it later. So let yourself count to 3 in your mind. Or if you really don't know what to say, let me think about that. But so often we just say something and regret having said it later. So allowing yourself to buy a little bit of time can also help you be much more conscious and intentional with your words as well.
Right. Yeah, I could see that. And it's also hard to allow yourself to have a pause, to have time, it's hard sometimes it's hard for the other person, because we're both, I think in society, we're used to like being very verbal and almost like verbally combative sometimes to find the boundaries instead of just, instead of being, stepping back and just listening and thinking, or what is it going to be? And that, and I mean that by really almost actively being in a pause, not withdrawing.
Oh yeah, there's a difference. There's a very active listening and pause. And sometimes I'll even say to somebody, I want to make sure I give you the correct answer. So let me think about this for a second. Really also framing it as, I want to do right by you. So let me make sure I'm clear on this, because so much of it's just reflexive. And like you said, making sure we're armored up and defending ourselves too, because it hurts to not defend.
Right. What do you feel like is some of the concepts that you're working on with your clients with boundaries now that are maybe newer ways of doing it, or newer ways of talking about boundaries?
We're doing so we're doing all the things we have done, and we're constantly adding to that as well. We're looking a lot at people pleasing, and how that plays into boundaries, and also boundaries in health. There's been a lot of data for a long time, but there's even more and more research coming out that shows how boundaries in health, even at the lack of boundaries at a very young age, things manifest, right? And I don't necessarily mean that in the wooest of ways, even though their woo has its place, but physiologically, somatically, things manifest. But the people,
are you talking about like nervous system being overstimulated kind of stuff?
Some of that, but really, when the nervous system has been in a parasympathetic or a sympathetic state, really trying to understand that boundaries help bring you to a parasympathetic state. Sympathetic to nervous parasympathetic. Yes, that was right. I had to go through my head.
I understand what you mean. Like you have to, remember this.
Yeah, that's a good thing. All of
and
that.
Parasympathetic means you get to like not be in your cortisol high. You can be in your resting space.
Right. And so in that sympathetic state, and the lack of boundaries really allows for that. And so just like anything we do I was an anatomy major, among other things, we're constantly working to try to get to that parasympathetic state. But people pleasing is something that we're doing a lot more of, because if you take a Venn diagram of people who are challenged with boundaries and people who might be defined as people pleasers, there's a lot of overlap. And that's tough, because I think people pleasing gets a bad rap, because it feels like another thing we're not doing right. Oh, I'm a people pleaser. But the deal is it's a double-edged sword. Did that come out?
Yes, that did.
A lot of things we like about ourselves are the ones that are in service, are things that are in service of others. So we have to so one of the things I'm doing is using Dr. Harriet Breaker's definition of people pleasing, which I love. People pleasers measure their self-worth by what they can do for others. And then we really look at are you doing that because you want to, or you feel compelled to, or there's some obligation. And that has really helped a lot of folks, and we go into greater depth, but to parse out, okay, it felt like I couldn't do people pleasing at all, not do it, but anything that felt people pleasing, I withdrew from or want to withdraw from, but I actually really like some of that. So we're really able to look at it more of what is, and sometimes there's overlap between what is an obligation and something you still enjoy. And that's where being able to hold the complexity and the discernment and finding nuance in these areas is really, really helpful.
Yes. Give us another one, because I like how you came into the parasympathetic and, really identifying the state of not having boundaries is almost the state of like hyper, or almost like hypervigilance, because you're trying to figure out what to do. And then versus the people pleasing, which is sometimes almost like a role you might play, like as a caretaker. Like I was just thinking when you were describing that, like a nurse who's on and, with their per patient load, she might not be that way, or he might not be that way off the job, but right then, like that's the role. Like, how can I help you? Okay, I want to get you to a certain state, like almost like a parasympathetic state, so that I know you're comfortable and relaxed and I've done my job, right? And then, maybe that's like, I know as a therapist, I sort of play that role with people to get them comfortable so they can talk to me about the things that they don't normally talk about, or things that are very uncomfortable. talk about. And but in my other life, I'm not a people pleaser. I actually know the difference between those things. You know, and so that's not a place where I have that I play in my social life, but I do know how to do that very taking care of people way, where people feel almost like the 2 on the Enneagram, right? Where I can however certain people, I think ER docs are a lot like that. Like a doctor that walks into an ER room, it's like, okay, this person needs me to be this way, and this person needs me to be this way to feel comfortable, right? So you know how to sort of take care of people in that way. But but what I'm also thinking is some people don't know the difference between when they're doing that and not doing that. Like they might just always be doing that as a part of their identity.
And I think that's very much the case for people who have a caregiving role. That's not just a professional role, but a partner, a parent, a special needs child who requires caregiving. Because, you know, you're talking about roles and how we occupy a role or fill a role, and sometimes we graduate from a role or can step out. But when it's a nested system, or that role, you know, you have that role in a couple different contexts, caregivers are never off. Very rarely are caregivers off. And so we work with a lot of caregivers on developing boundaries. Everything from looking at fatigue, compassion fatigue, to just the burnout that comes with that. Because if you're caregiving in a non-professional setting in particular, you know, somebody's health is at risk if you suddenly take the day off. And it's all on you. So how do you carve out boundaries within that space? So yeah, the rules part is really, really big.
Well, our boundaries in that space enough so that you don't have to be on all the time.
Exactly.
So that even if you do have a special needs child, or you are the person who's in charge of your family, or, you know, you're that person that does the thinking about safety in your family, or whatever it is, that there are times that you're like, okay, now I'm not on, and I can rest, and I can, you know, not be aware all the time.
Yeah. We talked about it. I grew up with somebody who ran an ER. My father ran ERs for where the ER he was in, but also oversaw them for the Navy at the time. And it was constant vigilance, but you have to be able to turn it off when you're out of it. To that point.
What you're saying is like a lot of what your boundary work with people is getting them to turn it off because they've created enough boundaries on them around themselves that they can.
In part, yes.
And were you able to see your dad do that? That he could shut off his vigilance? Yeah.
Sometimes. I mean, there are definitely times where it was handy for him to not. He could kind of just always be aware of what was going on, but he got to a point where he could step into the roles, which is really good.
Good. Yeah. I mean, I think it was actually what I think is really more interesting about that story is that you noticed it.
Kids notice things. Kids notice, and then they role model, right? And that's just to segue a little bit. That's also one of the reasons people are so challenged with boundaries. They either saw boundaries done in a way they don't want to emulate, or they didn't see boundaries at all. They didn't know they were a thing. So that I see a lot of that as well when we look at I call it the pathology of crappy boundaries. But when we look at the roots of boundary challenges, there's a lot of that there. Yeah.
So if you were working with the client, just because I really want people to hear like, okay, this is things I could work on right now, just to observe or to know like how my boundary setting is. And if I need to, you know, adjust it in some ways to feel comfortable, or how even do I know I'm feeling comfortable about the boundaries that I set? Are they enough? If someone came to you and they were saying, you know, I think my boundaries are, I don't think I have good boundaries, but I don't really even know how to do it at all. I don't even know what I don't know. And I don't know if I'm that uncomfortable really, because I've just been living like this for a long time.
Sure.
Never saying no, and not really being so bothered about being always on with people, or.
That's a really good question. I think the first thing I probably would ask, where in your life do you feel respect, and where don't you feel respect? Because one of my, you know, I help people self-define boundaries in a way that, so it's something they want to attain, it's aspirational, and sometimes it's hard to get there. So the first thing I say is, if boundaries were defined as respect, what would they look like? What would be possible there? respect for self, respect for others. And then that might be a good barometer of, oh, actually, I don't feel incredibly respected in my home life. Okay, let's look at that. What's going on there that doesn't feel like respect? Is it that you don't feel self-respect? You don't feel respect from the other people in your life at home? And then we start to parse that out a little bit. But a lot of times when people say, I don't know if I have boundaries or not, I'll say, well, probably not then. Because if boundaries, another thing we look at them are a container. They're a container for worthiness. So if you're feeling unworthy, you're feeling people pleasing, you're feeling a lack of self-respect. And then I think the one a lot of people go to is, where is resentment? These can really work as compasses to where you might want to have a boundary. Not, I think you should have a boundary, but where a boundary wants to be, because other feelings are coming up in the absence of boundaries being in place.
I see. So, okay, I'm just gonna repeat what you said, because that was really important things, really important terms. So you said it's a container of worthiness. And if you're thinking, oh, where do I start working on boundaries? Like it's the areas in your life where you might feel like there's no respect. And then where do you, and what other feelings are there instead, maybe, than respect? Like shame, or asking too much, or burdening someone, or I can't, or it's not right to do that. And then sort of asking yourself, what would you rather have there instead that might feel more respectful of you or your time or whatever it is. And then looking at it as that's like a way of creating like a worthy feeling for yourself. Like, oh, okay, well, yeah, if someone's on time for when I invite someone over, or when I invite people over, that they're on time, and then I'm like, okay, well, that's important. If I'm not on time, then I'm like not being worthy of, or I'm not being respectful of them coming over.
I think that's a really good way of that. That's one of several ways you can look at it. And when as you said that, I got an image of invisible ink. You put the lemon juice on it when you're a kid. I think it came in a cereal box or something. You'd hold it up to the light bulb, and suddenly you'd see where the lines were. When you ask yourself, where's the respect, or where's the respect missing, you start to see those natural fault lines where boundaries want to be. Yeah.
Right. It can be so confusing for people, I think, especially when we were talking about the model of boundaries. And I think kids are always looking at their parents of like, where's the boundary for that? Absolutely. And where's the boundary between you and this other person? Like let's say there's certain people in a family that are allowed in, or, into a family, or in any time they want, or the call can be taken at any time. Like kids really learn like, okay, some people get more boundaries than other people, and some people don't get any.
Oh, look, we dropped everything and tiptoe around this person, but not me.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's really interesting. And then of course, that kids will take that on and kind of start doing the same thing. And maybe that's just a normal thing, but I think there is this confusion sometimes. Like boundaries can be like completely confusing, for a confusing concept to teach, which I think is really interesting that you've taught it for so many years, because I'm sure you've been seeing every version of every boundary story. So yeah. And so there's something about like it almost like boundaries almost grow with a person. Once you start working on boundary work, you start growing your boundaries, or really identifying boundaries. And then I remember when I was first starting to be a therapist, and I was at a clinic, and people were talking a lot about boundaries in case conferences, right? Yeah. And then we started to talk about the boundaries that the staff members had towards each other. And it was a crisis clinic. So like crises were allowed in at any time, 5 minutes before you were leaving, you know what I mean? When you're with another case, like crises were allowed in. So you had to drop everything for crises. Right. It was really interesting because I remember practicing boundaries in that setting. And I felt like I had like my boundary setting armor was like so severe, like it was, because it wasn't really allowed to we weren't really allowed to have them. So if I ever did have them, people would question them. I'm like, no, I really do have to go. No, during my lunch, I'm not hanging out with you guys. I'm really going to be doing my own thing over here, and it wasn't like the group wasn't allowed to have boundaries, So that was a very interesting, and so my boundaries came off really strict. Like it was a very, almost like confrontative, like, whoa, saying, because it had to be so strong to be even heard, since that wasn't the venue for boundaries.
Right. Yeah, that reminds me of one of my other definitions for so I have multiple definitions, and I'll tell you two right now. One that it reminded me of, boundaries are expectation management. So you may not take a crisis that's not yours, not in your therapy setting, but a crisis at the grocery store, we're out of lemons. You don't have to jump in right there. But in the context of the therapy in clinicals and whatever you're doing, that was an expectation. While you're on the clock, we might have a crisis, we expect you here. And you also then set some expectations around your own boundaries. So that it was interesting how it went one way, but not necessarily, they weren't as accustomed to it going the other. And then just the other thing to mention, I have lots of definitions. I help people find what's aspirational for them. But my bottom line definition, our boundaries are the conditions you need to live the life, have the relationships, do the work, whatever it is that you want. And they ultimately are conditions to do those things. So whether it be respect, whether it be no phone calls after 10, I don't know, whatever those things are, it's going to look different in different contexts.
Right. And I think part of it in that particular clinic, I think it was easier for everyone to not have them at all, because that's kind of what the clinic was saying. That was the dominant place. But to have them a little bit, you really had to, that was expectations. For me, it was expectations I needed to have to be able to be there. Right.
Absolutely.
And so I think sometimes that's a really good way to think about it. It's expectations for you to be able to show up, expectations for you to do your best work, to be able to be yourself. And that part of that is, and when you were talking, I was thinking about, sometimes if you go away with a group of people, but you're just about to go on a retreat, and you know how that is when you go on a retreat, sometimes people can't just be with the group the whole time. So the expectation is like, okay, well, this is going to be the time that you don't have to be with the group so that you can be with the group other times, right? The expectation of how much time you don't have to show up and be as a group, which is important, because
it's super important. Yeah.
And that people respect that not everybody has to be social all the time, or not everyone has to be engaging all the time. And I think when we get more into familiar things, like with our families or friends, to say like, oh, I'm taking the morning off, or I'll see you guys at dinner, or I'm going to take the day to myself, and feel like that's not offensive, but that's a way that you might be setting to be able to show up.
I love that. And yet another one of my definitions is very in the spirit of this. Boundaries are like an instruction manual to get you at your best. And I've had people actually give their partner an instruction manual after I said this. I mean a little bit more metaphorically, unless that's what you both like. But hey, I really want to be, I see this a lot in business boundaries too. I really want to do my best with this work. So I'm not going to be able to do a shorter deadline for you. I'm going to need this time. Again, really saying what these conditions are, because I want you to get the very best. I want you to get the bang for your buck, or whatever that is. So I love that. Hey, I'm taking the morning off because I want to be at my best for you for dinner. The best I can be. Yeah.
Right. And I think that we were talking about that exact thing, is like the instruction manual that you have and that you can give to people about yourself. If you want me to show up, or this is how I can show up for you, or this is, I can do this, but I can't do that. And sometimes people have a lot of boundaries that you don't really expect, and it's hard to figure out where you can connect with them. But I always think when I meet people that are in that venue, that there needs to be more communication about their boundaries, so that it also makes for a comfort level around like understanding them, right?
Yes.
Because sometimes it might just be I think that's the finesse of boundaries, is like how you're able to talk about the boundaries that you need. That is more an I statements about you, and it has really nothing to do with the other person.
Not at all. It very rarely does it. And saying, okay, these are the hours I can work, as opposed to I can't work this time, but saying this is the menu, as opposed to these are all the things I can't offer you. This is the menu. And that also makes it a lot easier for people to comprehend and understand. Yeah. Right. Otherwise it starts to sound like negotiation if you're over explaining, giving too much information.
Right. And sometimes we might negotiate our boundaries, right? Because it might be Sometimes we might be, but a lot of times we're really checking in with ourselves or, to see what it is we need to be able to show up. Or to
Absolutely.
be able to be ourselves fully or
Yeah,
comfortable or relaxed or whatever it is.
you get it.
Yeah. So I think I'm glad that we're having, this feels like a refresher, but it also feels like a different level of,
Mhm.
of, examining boundaries again. Because I think there is a constant, like, where are you going to, for the people that are listening to this, I know they're listening to this because they want to really check into their boundary knowledge, right? And
Yeah.
so some of it is like, there's always a place to start with the boundaries, but there's always a place to grow. And like, it's maybe a lifelong learning.
I boundaries are never one and done. And I often say you never step into the same river twice, because there might be some things that are fairly permanent there, but there's also new flows and new eddies and different things floating in the water. There's been more rainfall. We're in California. There's been a lot of rainfall, and so it's never the same river twice. We're constantly taking the temperature. We're constantly seeing what we need. And I know as somebody who has fluctuating hormones right now, sometimes what worked for me a year ago might not work for me now. And being able to ebb and flow with and meet our needs, understand whatever those conditions are, they could be changing. So just checking in and checking in and checking in.
Yeah. I think that's right. Checking in and seeing what has changed in your idea about what kind of boundaries you need. And for me, on my side, I would say I think the biggest thing that I want people to think about from our talk is this whole idea about pausing to really actively listen to what do you need in that moment, or what do you need in order to be able to respond to that person that is about you being able to show up and be comfortable, kind of out of that hypervigilant state. Like, I don't know what to do, or I just should say yes, or to really take a minute to be like, what is the thing that's going to work here for me?
Yes.
Not just the no, not just the yes, not just
That's
like
everything.
out of this conversation.
That pause is everything, because it prevents you from offering something you hope somebody will decline, potentially, and it allows you to offer, if you want to, something you hope they will. And so that it becomes a fork in the road for how you feel about the next part of this relationship or the conversation. And that pause is very, very powerful. And it doesn't, I say awkward pause. That's because we generally just keep talking because we don't like any sort of awkward feeling. But being able to buy 2 seconds of time, check in with your breathing, whatever that is, that makes a huge difference.
Or it might even be that great phrase, like, I'll have to get back to you on that one. I'm really going to have to think about that more. I don't want to say yes too prematurely. I don't want to say no too quickly. I mean, I think there's some grace there. That's compassionate.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I want to make sure I give you the right answer. So let me think about it. I'll get back to you by X or something like that. And we don't always have the possibility of that, but when we do, take it.
Right.
I
Exactly.
mean, if you know, you know. But if you're not sure or you're hesitant, give yourself a minute. Give yourself whatever you can get.
I think that is like the best way for us to end our conversation around boundaries, like just giving yourself a minute. Don't feel pressured into doing something. It's a constant learning.
Absolutely.
Always really great to talk to you, Randi. I'll be getting you in and in and in for probably the rest of the time I'm doing this work with people, because I think it's such an important topic.
Well, I'll be showing up because I love the work you do with people.